Unfortunately, although there are um, many great efforts to leverage cloud computing to overcome traditional and standard disabilities or just to meet the preferences of users, there are also some accessibility challenges related to cloud computing. And we've seen an example of those. What we're going to talk about now is the yellow umbrella. That is what you can do to prevent accessibility from raining on your cloud computing parade. First, we know that part of the yellow umbrella is making sure that we comply with the appropriate accessibility standards to implement inclusive cloud computing. There are two major standards that we have discussed throughout this entire session. One is the W3C Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, version 2.0, and the other is U.S. Section 508 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. Section 508 was enacted to eliminate barriers in information technology, to make available new opportunities for people with disabilities, and to encourage the development of technologies that would help to achieve those goals. This law applies to all federal agencies when they develop, procure, maintain, or use electronic and information technology. One of the things that we have seen is that outside of the United States, Section 508 doesn't apply, but other governments are aligning their policies with WCAG 2.0. That's their accessibility standards. And WCAG 2.0 covers a wide range of recommendations for making web content more accessible. It was published as a W3C recommendation back on the 11th of December 2008. And we know that following these guidelines can help make content accessible to a wider range of people with disabilities, including blindness and low vision, deafness and hearing loss, learning disabilities, cognitive limitations, limited movement, speech disability, and many others and combinations of those. But beyond disabilities, these standards, WCAG 2.0 standards, can make your web content more usable. If we'll look at this next slide, I just wanted to share with you this example of how the two relate to each other, how Section 508 and how WCAG 2.0 relate. If we go through Section 508, we'll see this example right here of a text equivalent for every non-text element shall be provided. It's a fairly simple statement, but if we get into the W3C example that equates to that, we'll see more detailed guidance of what's required, and it's a bit more prescriptive, and it provides more detail around what somebody needs to do in order to be able to comply. So for web pages that launch virtual machines and for web pages that launch virtual machines that reside in the cloud, for web interfaces, for cloud management, and for any web-based services deployed on the cloud, you'll still want to make sure that these comply with WCAG 2.0, and for federal government scenarios, Section 508. Or if you're from another part of the world, you'll want to make sure that you understand what the requirements are for you and align with those standards. The reality of standards. If we turn our attention over to the standards and open source activity around cloud computing, you're going to see that there is tremendous movement and activity in this space. There are dozens of new communities and organizations that have formed around cloud standards, including industries and different governments, including China and the United States and others. And there are a number of activities that I'd like for you to take away from here. The key is that no one organization is covering everything, and what we're seeing is that these standards organizations are starting to work a bit more with each other, and they're trying to coordinate a bit better so that there is not conflict in the recommendations and standards and guidelines that are developed across each of these groups. At the same time, if you take a look at the work that's being done across all of these areas, there's really nothing in there that speaks to how to provision cloud services to ensure that they're accessible to users, or at least nothing that I have been able to find. We are working on influencing and having an impact where it's required, but some of this work has already been underway or has been already cooked to a certain point where you won't see accessibility described within this. We can imagine that if we're discussing management use cases, that we would expect that there would be individuals with disabilities, and that as we implement that use case, we would make sure that the capabilities are accessible, but there's certainly nothing in there that tells us that it has to be. So there's a lot of detail. I'm not going to go through what every single one of these organizations is doing, but the main key here is that there is a lot of activity happening. One of the organizations that is very helpful to helping customers make sense of this complexity is the Cloud Standards Customer Council. The purpose of that organization is to really look at the standards from the customer perspective. You know, we tend to have a lot of vendors and a lot of IT organizations participating in cloud standards, and the purpose of the Cloud Standards Customer Council is to bring in that real-world perspective to provide some input to the standards organizations based on what these companies and what these customers are experiencing in their efforts to deploy cloud environments or to leverage cloud services. The organizations that we met on the previous page, they accept CSCC, that's Cloud Standards Customer Council input as requirements, and CSCC is really an end user advocacy group that is dedicated to accelerating cloud successful adoption and drilling down into the standards. There are currently over 290 companies that are participating, and over half of them operate outside of the IT realm. You have companies, you do have IBM is included, you have Lockheed Martin, Citigroup, State Street, North Carolina State University, and others. Participation has really expanded since the CSCC was announced by OMG back in the first quarter of 2011. We have not been able to get accessibility addressed within all of the standards where there might be a logical application. It's just not there, and it's a huge scope of work. And it's going to take time to do that, and frankly, to be honest with you, people still see accessibility as something that you do after a solution is developed. However, I mention the CSCC because I really believe, as many others do, that accessibility is something that you need to build into your cloud solution rather than trying to deal with it after your deployment. Accessibility needs to be built in as you're adopting your cloud solution, as you're creating your services to be delivered on the cloud, and as you're creating your images to be deployed on the cloud. That's your yellow umbrella. And the Cloud Standards Customer Council, the CSCC, formed a practical guide to cloud computing work group early last year, and I served as the lead technical editor for that activity. What we did was we delivered that guide, and it identifies ways that you can create an inclusive cloud computing deployment. That's not the primary purpose, but throughout you'll see references and you'll see opportunities to build accessibility in. We've identified key steps throughout the life cycle, where accessibility can and should be taken into consideration. For example, first, when you assemble your team that is working on a cloud computing deployment, you'll want to make sure that you include someone or have access to somebody who has an accessibility perspective and expertise. That person is going to be available to help you as you go along through the process to make sure that you're deploying an inclusive cloud computing solution. Next, when you deploy your enterprise cloud strategy, or when you develop your enterprise cloud strategy, you'll want to consider the impact of accessibility and earlier, we also discussed the security constraints. You'll want to look at the security constraints and make sure that you're considering accessibility requirements in that mix early on as you're developing your business case and your strategy. In step 5, when you're determining who will develop and test and deploy your cloud services, remember that accessibility testing needs to be a part of all aspects, from including testing the management administrative consoles, to testing the functionality of the assistive technologies that are going to be interacting with virtual machines, and then to the services that are being deployed on the cloud. In step 6, make sure that you develop a proof of concept before moving to production, and that proof of concept includes testing accessibility. In step 7, when you're integrating with existing enterprise services, ensure that the overall solution is accessible. When it comes to managing the cloud environment, you're going to want to provide enablement, education, and documentation of how to access with assistive technologies. Remember the story about how JAWS needed to be run on both the virtual image and the local desktop. Provide that guidance to your users to make it easy for persons with disabilities and others to use your solution. So in short, the yellow umbrella is building accessibility into your cloud computing solution. I thank you very much for your time, and if you have any questions, I would be happy to address them. Just send email to the address E as in Elizabeth, V as in Vera, Woodwa, WOODWA @us.ibm.com. Thank you and have a fantastic day.